The thousands of soldiers that signed up for war in the summer of 1914 didn't know much of what their living conditions would be like. At the start of the war, food quantity wasn't a problem because the troops went prepared as well as received food in the mail. As time went by, however, food wasn't as available as before. Most of the food consisted of stale and tasteless bread and the like. Soldiers never got hot food and were usually left hungry. Soldiers faced bigger problems than lack of food as the war went on. When a day of fighting was over, they went back to the trenches, their safe haven. The life inside trenches that the soldiers dug up tended to be far from hygienic. Because of the lack of space, cleanliness was hard to come by. As a result, there were many rats living amongst the soldiers. Rats stole food and ate through clothing and bedding. Not only were the rats unpleasant to live with, but they spread diseases through the trenches. With the closeness of the living quarters, it wasn't hard for disease to spread quickly, especially since rats would beget up to 900 offspring per year. But under harsh weather conditions was when soldiers in the trenches suffered the most, especially from overflooding and the cold winter. To pass the time inside the trenches, soldiers liked sending their loved ones letters and eagerly waiting for a response to keep them connected to life outside of the war. Life on the trenches wasn't easy, but what was hardest to cope with, along with the loneliness and the trauma of witnessing war, was the fear of being attacked by the enemy. Soldiers took shifts watching the outside of the trench to make sure no enemies were approaching. They always carried a haversack. Their haversack consisted of their basic essentials such as utensils and personal hygiene kits. There was also space for ammunition. If a soldier was caught sleeping on the job, he could be sentenced to death or imprisoned. Soldiers were required to have their rifle with them at all times in case of an intrusion. They used a tool called a periscope that safely mirrored the top of the trench so that one could check for intruders without risking their safety. The newest types of technology allowed the nations involved in the war to have much more dangerous weapons and much more efficient transportation. Railways were the main form of transportation used by armies to move weaponry and soldiers to the borders. Railways made it easier to have accessible resources at all times. If the opposing army happened to get across to their enemy, soldier or weapon replacements were always nearby. In 1916, the British decided that they needed a strong vehicle to go into battle with that can demolish barbed wire, machine gun posts, and other weapons of the enemy. The vehicle was meant to be very durable and able to remain undamaged by harsh ground conditions. The vehicle's code names were tanks because they looked like water containers. There weren't many tanks built before they decided to test it out. The tanks had a lot of faults and they were far from perfect. However, the Germans found out that they were building such a vehicle, so they prepared themselves with tools that can fight against it. Many of the attempts to better the tanks failed, and the tanks remained slow and dysfunctional for most of the war. German soldiers used a type of aircraft called a Zeppelin. Its shape was long and cylindrical and was used for bombing and observation of a region in an attempt to find the location of the enemy. Mainly people in the towns and cities saw the Zeppelins because the Zeppelins were mainly used to bomb British cities. Soldiers saw more of the smaller aircrafts in combat. At the start of the war, enemy aircrafts did not have problems with each other. They even greeted each other in the air. Eventually, people realized that the enemy planes had a lot of information to gather from one another, so air traffic became a problem. Enemy aircraft started behaving violently towards each other. At first, pilots and aircrafts would shoot at other planes to try and destroy the enemy. It proved less effective than having timed built-in machine guns in the aircraft. Towards the end of the war, Britain and Germany started using planes that could carry more weight for bombs and could fly longer distances. Pilots had little accuracy when releasing bombs from aircrafts, but they still caused many deaths. The weapons that soldiers had to face out on the battlefield were brutal. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, mortars, and more were used during the Great War. Large caliber guns were the cause of most of the deaths between 1914 and 1918. Soldiers were terrified that they'd get blown to bits, just as they see their fellow comrades viciously killed beside them during battle. Artillery was ordered to surround enemy trenches before soldiers would come to the trenches themselves. The idea was that the weapons being used on the enemy would do most of the work, so soldiers wouldn't have to risk their lives more than they needed to. Sending the artillery to the enemy trenches proved effective because it would kill a lot of soldiers in the trenches and destroy a lot of their resources, therefore making it harder for them to fight back once they are attacked by the enemy. Over on the Western Front, they needed something that would get them out of the tight spot that they were in, something fatal that would help them advance in the war. And so the discovery of poisonous gas occurred. The poisonous gas would make anyone who breathes in the green air die slowly of asphyxiation by being directly exposed to the gas. The gas would cause severe burning of the eyes, skin, and respiratory tract, and people would cough up blood when they inhaled it. Gas masks were eventually created in an attempt to survive the poisonous gas. Over 60 types of poisonous gases were attempted during the war. Not all of them were lethal, but they caused disruptions in the trenches and caused long-term health problems for those who inhaled it. Both sides of the war had equally lethal technology, but it didn't help them win the war. Weapons during the Great War did more of torturing than effectively defeating the enemy.